Okay, so not necessarily the most obvious topic, but the co-author on this paper researches this area over at ECU. Sort of came to me and said, look, you know a little bit about this statistics stuff. I'm interested in this. There are a few flags in some research done there, and that spiked my interest, and I kind of got much more involved in this project which is why I'm now the first author. So it came out a little bit out of the blue, more because I might have some ability to do some estimation in this area, and that's really how I got involved. But I've become a bit more engaged in this. Now, if it's a live seminar, we know that Steve would be walking in the door 5 minutes late. So I do have a roadmap slide to let you know, just to give Steve a little bit of extra time to join. But you will notice that there'll be a quiz at the end of this, so everyone has to pay attention, otherwise you'll be in trouble. Okay, so pretty standard format for how we're going along here. Is this an important area to be looking at? If you look in the US at the moment, you've got more than 2 million people in the correctional facilities system, including jails and prisons, and it costs a lot of money, right? Around 81 billion a year at the moment. That is the direct tangible cost of running prisons, jails, parole, and probation. Okay, so this is a really expensive activity that goes on in the US. I've then listed a whole bunch of other costs that are not included in that 81 billion, which run from things that we might be particularly concerned about, as well as costs on society around policing and legal system costs. We have victim of crime costs. You may or may not be particularly concerned about potential lost productivity, but there are real costs on prisoner families. You know, you can, hi, I'm a kid going to school. What does your dad do? Well, my dad's in jail. You know, these are non-trivial social pressures that people face. So there's a lot of serious problems here. There's a really large financial number here, and there's a real human cost. So this is worth looking at in some detail. Now there is, okay, so while I've said that this was a bit out of left field, I did, you know, this is the AgEcon seminar series, so I did want to give you some background and say, how does this link to agricultural markets? And this is also by way of giving you a little bit of history. So in the early 1900s, in the South, you had a system where the production system was built up around slave labour. What they confected was a whole series of laws which meant that if you were a black male in many southern states, it was very easy to issue you with a very large fine that would send you to jail, and then any white man could buy out your fine and have you work in the fields for them at a really, really low rate. And you confected a system that basically ensured 100% recidivism, so you kept these people in essentially forced labour. So this is around 1900, and this is what was really going on in the South. If you look at it today, actually prison farm labour is still hugely important in the system. You can be a prison worker in California as migrant labour has disappeared, and you might be earning around $3 an hour. So the minimum wage in the US is $10 an hour. Why would you be doing this as a prisoner? If you're in prison and you want to make a phone call, it costs you $2 a minute. Right? So where are you going? So 30 bucks for a 15-minute phone call. Where are you going to get the money to make anything like a phone call? You have to do some activities, right? So there's around about 30,000 prisoners currently working in farms in the US, right? So it's non-trivial. And I've just got there in the bottom, people might notice that farms continue to play an important part in prisoner rehabilitation, right? So the local one here, that's a sign for Carnet Prison Farm that's not that far from Perth. So yes, okay, you know, this is something, but just, you know, I thought I'd throw that in there. There is some relevance to agricultural economics. If you're not particularly familiar with this literature, so I've sort of highlighted that, you know, you go to the 1900s, basically this is a system of exploitation of people. At some point, the feds in the US sort of intervened in the system, and you emerge in the 50s and 60s that the prison system has a focus on some sort of rehabilitation aspects. Then we get into the 1970s, and a hugely influential piece of work comes out in 1974, which turns the whole system away from rehabilitation towards nothing works. Okay, so there's no point trying to do rehabilitation, it doesn't work, and this fundamentally changed the attitude of the way the system worked in the US. Nothing works, there's no point investing in these people, they're a lost cause. And that was the philosophy that emerged. You then sort of, things go full cycle. So by the 90s, you start to see another stream emerging in the literature, which is to say, look, the reality is that it is possible to do rehabilitation work. It's just complex. You need to look at the circumstances of the individual prisoner. What are the source causes for this, and get at those things. So yes, things work, but you have to look at this in a detailed way, and that was where things started to emerge. You also start to see some people trying to summarize the literature, and again, what sort of emerges from those summaries is this idea that, look, trying to understand the evaluation programs is really difficult because the motivations and the data that's collected is really heterogeneous, that we don't know the motivations for collecting this, and it's really difficult to draw any conclusion. So we go from this nothing works attitude to that things work, and then this idea that we can try and have some systematic understanding of this literature, being really hard to tease out what that might be. So that brings us sort of up to date, where you might think that, well, when we have this sort of problem, meta-analysis is a really effective way of bringing this heterogeneous literature together under some common sort of metric, and we might be able to make some sense of the literature in that way. And that's really what starts to happen in the 2000s. The effect size that people model here is return to prison. So the log, you model the log odds of the return to prison, or that's your effect size for those that participate in correctional education programs and those that do not. And because log odds ratios are really difficult to understand, they tend to report back in terms of odds ratios. And there's sort of an evolution of literature that took place here. So the first sort of go at this really focused on the quality of the data and didn't think that the underlying data was very good. So they're going to be the things that we might be concerned about, that there's endogeneity and sample selection bias here, that controls are not really detailed. And so they were just saying that the underlying evidence is not of a quality that can really be summarized. It then sort of moved on a bit, and people said, well, we can still do some of these things. And that first sort of study said, look, most programs do seem to have some positive impact on reducing recidivism, but some programs do not. And they pointed out that life skills kinds of programs were shown to not have any benefit. Fast forward to 2013, and we have this very large, centrally funded study by RAND. Okay, so this is going to be a well-resourced study from these guys. And if you start to look at what they report, this is pretty radical evidence, right? So an odds ratio of about 0.6 for changing your odds of return to prison if you participate in a correctional education program. That's a really material difference from from 1, if you ask me. And then if you look at their cost calculations, these are pretty dramatic findings, right? If you take the upper and lower bounds and swap them around and say this is the maximum range for a benefit cost ratio, they're saying the benefit cost ratio for correctional education programs is between 5 and 7. And all they're measuring is the savings in terms of prison costs. So they said that if you run correctional education programs in prisons, the amount you will save in terms of the costs of running your prison system alone are 5 to 7 times greater than the cost of running those programs. Now, for someone like me, I think that that's implausibly large, okay? So my prior is that I don't believe that result. It's just, that's a really high benefit cost ratio. So when I see something like that, I might be inclined to think about it a little bit more. So if you go and dig into their study, you can see the things that are going to start to flag for me. First, these guys report that the study fails a publication bias test, a traditional test, but they apply no correction. And we subsequently have this big EJ paper that says in about half of 130 odd literature, so that's 130 odd meta-analyses, that publication bias has had a really dramatic effect on the effect size that's reported in the literature. So we might be really worried about that. I've spoken to the original authors around why they didn't do a correction test, and their argument was that they were confident that they had identified every study, right? So they said, look, this data is hard to get to do these kinds of studies, so we're pretty confident that we got everything that was done. And so we don't think that there are papers sitting in a file drawer. That is their defense for finding publication bias and not correcting for it. Okay, the next one is a killer one for me, and this is what really set off some alarm bells. If you're doing this kind of analysis, you want to be using marginal costs, not average costs. And we all know that, but it's even clear in this specific literature. So in this specific field, they have guidelines and books, and this is the reference for what you do that. And if you look them up, it's explicitly clear in the field of policy evaluations in the prison system that you should be using marginal costs, not average costs. And the RAND report uses average costs. Okay, so I think that that's probably where the problem lies. My idea with this publication bias, I'm possibly not as worried about that as I might be in some other literatures, because I feel that there's this strong history of people happy to find programs don't work, right? And so that means that a null result would actually be publishable in this literature, because there's this debate, you know, people are saying like, here, I've studied this and this is evidence that nothing works. So I'm not necessarily so worried about this. I mean, I think that if you fail a test, publication bias test, you should at least explore the issue. But really this average marginal cost thing worries me. And so the question here that we're going to look at is, well, this study has racked up around 400 sites. Okay, so this is a study that is having some material impact in the field. People are concluding on the basis of this that there is a radically positive outcome from running prison correctional education systems, just in prison cost system savings alone. And the question of interest here is, well, if we fix up this marginal and average costing, if we fix up this publication bias thing, will we reach a different conclusion? So here is an overview of this. So this is starting off with a replication process. That is what I want to get at here. And there's a number of steps involved. So the first thing is we had to get copies of all of these papers, right? So we're going to say we're questioning the RAND's conclusions. So we need to get all that data. And that was quite a complicated process, because some of these are PhD dissertations and they're reports, internal prison documents. But we did manage to get all of these papers. We then had two separate people independently calculate the effect size from all of those papers. And then when we reconcile those with the RAND database. Now this is really important because across RAND author 1 and author 2, in about 50% of cases, we disagreed with what was the effect size that we should be taking from the paper. So that's pretty important, this idea of not just one person doing this, but that you have multiple people looking at this and reconciling the values. I'll explain a little bit later why I think some of the stuff RAND did was wrong. But even excluding RAND, author 1 and author 2 disagreed on a number of occasions about what was the most appropriate value to take from the study. So now that we have collated all of that information, reconciled all of that information, We then want to reproduce RAND, all right? And we want to say, like, would RAND have reached a different conclusion? We want to then use the revised values that we've decided are most appropriate. And then as a final step, we want to allow for some heterogeneity across program types. So extend the kind of analysis that's being done. The next thing to note that is, I'm not going to stab you in the back, I'm going to stab you in the chest. So I'm going to give you a draft of the paper that's going to criticize your work, and you're going to get a chance to respond before it gets sent out for publication. I think that that is only fair in doing this, saying, look, did you make a mistake? Maybe you would like to look at that. Maybe you have some reasons for doing that. And certainly I did incorporate the feedback that we got from the authors on their justification for doing certain things. You know, some cases they went, well, the RA is gone, or, you know, we can't resolve that, or I don't know. Other cases they had some reasoning, and I think that that was a fair, clearly they're not necessarily going to agree with me, but that was a fair and reasonable thing to do, and it's just good ethical practice, right? Now, so that's the overview of the flow. I do want to highlight something because I know people do this sort of meta-analysis stuff in the school, and it's around this idea of the common metrics. And a lot of these studies do really different things. And what we need to do is we need to have a common metric that we can analyze as part of this. And the approach that I took to doing that was to work out that across vast variety of literatures, a whole series of ways have been worked out to convert things to Cohen's D. Not only Cohen's D, but a measure of estimate uncertainty around Cohen's D. And what that means is that all of these studies are reporting all different things. If I can map everything into Cohen's D, it means then I can map everything back from Cohen's D to the effect size metric of my choice, right? Which in this case, I choose to model log odds and then report back in odds. But I think that this is a really neat conceptual thing that you can do. You could just stay with D, right? I could just analyze all this and say, is there a material? We have guidance on what interpretation of D, this effect size stuff means. So we can do that. And I think that this is one possible way that people looking at this try and go, well, where's my common metric? All right, whatever you've got, you can convert it into D and then move on from D to your analysis. And so that's that's how I did this. Get everything into D. Once everything is in D, map everything back into log odds, model in log odds, right? And you could do that in whatever it worked for your particular context. I just give some examples of how you can do that. In terms of estimation, again, lots of ways you can do this. If you're in the economics field, you think that this stuff doesn't look especially different from a panel data model, where you are particularly a random effects panel data model, or something panel data model with robust standard errors. That's true, but there are some specific languages that these guys use in meta-analysis, and because I'm trying to sell this research in that specific field, I follow their conventions. But what is a random effects meta-regression model is largely what we understand to be a panel data model with a robust covariance matrix. There's a few tricks in there around weighting structures. Okay, so we can talk about those in detail, but it's not especially important for this. But I follow a well-recognized methodology in terms of estimation. For publication bias, I use two different approaches, and I'll show you the results of those. For costs and benefits, the approach I'm going to take here is to model the difference in the probability of return to prison through time. Okay, so I have a probability of return to prison at any given time point for someone in the treatment group and someone in the control. I'm going to model the difference in those marginal probabilities, and I'm going to use that as my guide to get costs and benefits. I just want to conceptually highlight this publication bias thing around why things drop out in the way that they do. Okay, say this is the example here. Here's my sampling distribution. The idea with this publication bias is that we have some extreme observations. How is it possible to get an extreme sample? largely you can only get extreme examples if you take a small sample. Small samples by construction have large standard errors, right? So you can only end up with a sample that is out in those tails if this is my sampling distribution here, if my underlying sample is quite small. That's how I'll get something far from the true population effect. They have large standard errors, and it's that large standard error which you can use to tease out these observations that might be problematic. And both corrections rely on that basic property that these studies that are low or small samples will have large standard errors. Okay, the other thing that I would like to do, it turns out that the recidivism rate is around 50%. And I'm going to use that as a neat, easy way for us to understand odds ratios in terms of probabilities, right? So the baseline probability of recidivism is 50%. Now that is just approximately, so it's not exact, but it does mean that in terms of understanding the impact of these programs, we have a really simple metric. We've got the probability of recidivism in the treatment group and the probability compared to a probability of recidivism in the control of 0.5, right? And so we can look at that and we can actually understand the size of these effects. So first step, can I directly replicate what RAND did, and can I apply bias corrections to what RAND did? And this is what happens when you do that. So you can see we have this original study from RAND. If I do a direct replication, I don't get exactly what they do, but there's, we've got different estimators here, and I'm satisfied that the direct replication matches closely enough to what RAND did that, yes, I'm pretty confident I've got the same data set as RAND. I then go through the mechanics of applying publication bias corrections, and you can see that it does change the result a little bit, okay? Instead of dropping the probability of return to prison by 12 percentage points, it drops it by 9 percentage points. But you're still coming to the conclusion that correctional education, prison education programs have a positive impact on recidivism, okay? So not you might say that, well, I looked at this and yes, you were right to correct for it, but qualitatively, that doesn't make a big difference to my findings. Okay, so next step is to say, I really found the values they used a little bit problematic, and I think that things should have been done differently. The first thing is that 4 studies didn't meet their own inclusion criteria. So they evaluated the impact of the level of education, not participation in a correctional education program, or the study was about a holistic program of which education was a small part. So there's a lot, so 4 studies clearly were incorrectly included in the RAND study based on their own definition, and there's no dispute about that. RAND chose if there was a vocational education program and say a basic education program. By basic education, I mean high school level literacy, really basic literacy standards. They pulled those values and reported 1 value. My preference is to say that, well, let's take the vocational education numbers as 1 lot of numbers, and let's take the basic education program numbers as another set of numbers, okay? So that is a researcher choice. I obviously prefer my choice, but it's not a hanging offence. The next one that comes along is this real problem that I have with RAND, okay? So when they constructed their data, they always went to the raw data table that was presented. And I give one of the more egregious examples here, where is in the appendix to their report, they show that this Lattimore study had an odds ratio of 0.58. So really, really strong effect. But if you actually read the paper, there's a regression model, and the output from the regression model is there's no effect, right? So RAND is consistently taking raw proportions data even when someone estimates a regression model that has some controls. In this case, this actually was an IV model, so it was a really good controlled study, and it reaches no effect, whereas they're taking raw proportions data and concluding there is an effect. And there are a number of examples of this, so that their method of data collation is wrong in a small but non-trivially small proportion of studies. So given there is this discrepancy between what data they used and what data they should have used, it's worth saying, well, do the errors in their data management fundamentally impact the conclusions? And so we have a look at that this time. So again, you can see the direction that this is pushing. If you look at the two publication bias corrections, now we're going from dropping the recidivism rate by 12 percentage points in the RAND study to dropping it by around 7 percentage points. All right, so again, it weakens the case that these programs have an effect, but it doesn't completely remove the idea that these programs have an effect. Okay, so then the next thing I want to look at is allowing for some heterogeneity. So I said that we collect these different groups. And here you can start to see that things do look a little bit different. Again, we're still moving in the same direction, or if I want, actually we can look at these in the probabilities because they tend to make a little bit more sense to people. You can see participation in the post-secondary education having a really material impact on your level of recidivism. Much weaker evidence for vocational training programs, and sort of again weaker evidence again for academic fundamentals. Now I should say across this literature I don't have a huge problem in thinking about that there's endogeneity, because you can do really nasty stuff to prisoners. So you have no rights, so you might be assessed as needing an education treatment, and we just assign you to the control group anyway. So you would never get ethics approval to do that kind of study here and say, like, we've identified someone that needs treatment as per our policy, and yet we're not going to give them treatment because we want to run an experiment and see what happens, right? And that's really what happens in some of these studies. You also have other things where enrollment in basic education might be compulsory, right? So there's not, if it's compulsory, if you meet certain criteria, there's not necessarily a selection problem. I feel much less confident in the post-secondary education data that there's no underlying endogeneity problem here. The source data is much smaller here, and there probably is some sort of selection issue going on there in the source data. But regardless of that, I think that we still are getting this story around these programs having some impact. Now, what was just unpacking that, so if you look here, you can see these, like, what's going on in these changes here, what with these bias corrections. And what I've done here is I've just grouped the studies in terms of those that have low power, so they would be the small sample studies, and those that have, against some fairly arbitrary definition, adequate power. And what you can see is that these there's not really that much systematic bias going on in the studies. So these so this is just the distribution of effect sizes for low powered studies. And there's not, if you look at the peak, they're not radically different from those with high power. So that's where and the vocational one moves, you can see that it is a little bit more away from the mean. And that's where I think there was not this particularly strong push towards publication bias in the sense that null results were excluded from the literature. But you do see a different distribution. You can definitely see more extreme values are recorded in these low power studies, which is consistent with the theory of how these things would be detected. So what does that mean? So if we just went back to my proposition 1 and said, well, if you fixed up marginal cost versus average cost, and you fixed up publication bias, even though that's not big, would you have reached a different conclusion? And the answer to that is yes, you would reach a fundamentally different conclusion. Being able to identify a number of cases where we have both average cost and marginal cost per day per prisoner, and you might find some of those numbers frighteningly low. Okay, so the marginal cost of keeping a prisoner in Pennsylvania is $15 a day. All right, so these are frighteningly low numbers. South Carolina, $10. But what it does tell you is that I feel reasonably confident in saying that, well, if the prison system marginal cost is going to be around a quarter of average cost. And if I apply that correction, I apply some cost of treatment adjustments that they got a little bit wrong. We see the cost of treating 100 inmates, 185. The benefits in terms of direct costs in the prison system, only less than 160 grand. So correctional education programs do not generate tangible prison cost savings commensurate with the cost of running those programs. That's not a particularly pleasant finding, but that's of course only a partial look at costs and benefits. The way that I think we should look at costs and benefits in here is I look at the difference between my treatment groups. So here I've got, I've calibrated to some data, a recidivism curve through time for my base case and my treated case. There's a lot of stuff going on in the background here. And what you can see on my last figure here is the difference in the marginal probability of return to prison in any given month between the treatment group and the control, right? And so it's that difference that triggers a return to prison event, and that is what triggers the cost savings in terms of, or the differences. So I'm looking at the difference in the marginal probability of return to prison through time, and I'm using that difference to trigger the various savings in the events. Now, it's much more comprehensive than just looking at prison costs. Prison costs are easy. We know average cost of a stay, and we know marginal cost. We've got a bunch of other costs, police costs, legal system costs, and victim of crime costs. Now, there's a lot of, as I said, there's $81 billion a year spent on prisons. There's a lot of interest in this stuff. And so you can actually find things that look like marginal costs. So we've got tabulated in the US labor time for police and the legal system by major criminal activity, right? So I'm going to say that if we just took labor costs, that's a pretty good proxy for the marginal cost of these things. So we steal a car, there's, nearly $1,000 worth of police labor cost in processing that, and $250 in government incurred legal costs. And you can see murder costs there as well. And the same exists for victim of crime costs. So and the thing to really highlight here is one, murder, and then two, the intangible for murder. And the basis for this are awards made in courts, right? So there's an economics literature around this kind of stuff, but we've got these values based on what the legal system throws out. We've got data on the distribution of crimes and clearance rates and all of these things, so we can actually pack together a pretty comprehensive picture of what's going on. We also have some other things that are going to be very relevant here, and one is related to the reason for the return to prison, right? So if you return to prison as a parole violation, this has a number of things related to how much time you're going to serve in prison, because it's only going to be the remainder of your sentence as a maximum. And many states have maximum legislation if it's a parole violation. So they say, if you've got a parole violation, you can't do more than 30 days or 90 days in prison. So it's no longer the average sentence. The other thing is that a parole violation is not generally going to be a violent crime, right? It's going to be some trivial drunken disorderly or some kind of small thing, a small issue, DUI, you've done something, you failed to register something. So because we've got violent crimes trigger so much of the cost, parole violation return to prisons have a much lower cost on the community. And depending on the share between parole violations and new crimes, could have a very radical difference in terms of the costs imposed. Got some other things, got estimate uncertainty that we need to deal with. There is a specific policy recommendation for the discount rate, but clearly we can have different choices around that value. And the other thing that I face as a problem is that while I've got different program types, I only have information on the cost of the education budget for the prison system as a whole, right? So I can't actually tease out everything that I would like to in this space. But let's have a look at what we get. So the scale of the savings, if we look at all of these marginal costs, we look at all of these cost categories, and I'm looking at a representative distribution of return issues. That means that I'm weighting by average parole violations and crime distribution and all of those things, all of those many categories, these many distributions, what drops out at the end? So a couple of things drop out at the end. One, you can see that overwhelmingly these results are driven by intangible victim of crime costs. Right, remember I have about 1,800 as my cost per prisoner for basic education programs, and here are my savings. So you can see that only when you start to add in those intangible victim of crime costs are things going to look comfortably that the benefits outweigh the costs. The other thing that I want to highlight is this total overwhelming proportion of the cost that's driven by things that involve a loss of life, right? So if there's a program that is impacting that side of things, it matters. Or if none of the return to prison events associated with post-secondary were ever related to crimes that involved loss of life, then that would change the story dramatically around what would happen, right? And I've got some indication of just how sensitive this is with some indicative sensitivity analysis on the numbers here, which is here. And probably the one that I would draw your attention to is the parole share. So in the US, you can get return to prison parole violation numbers state by state. And this top bar shows that if I picked the state with the highest share of return to prison triggered by parole violations and the lowest share, how much do the cost or how much do the benefits change? And really what that's doing is that's shifting the proportion of people that fall into a low cost crime category into a category that is a distribution of many cost crime categories. And you can see that just within the observable data for state variation in parole share, how much of an impact that has on total benefits. Prison costs, if you just look at tangible costs, that's what drives that. And most of the other stuff doesn't really make much difference. For that victim of crime costs and estimate uncertainty, I'm just playing around with the bounds of things that are reported in the data. Some of this stuff comes from simulation studies and the like. So what are my conclusions? My conclusions are that publication bias is an issue, but it doesn't change the conclusion that correctional education programs reduce recidivism. The RAND conclusion, however, is fundamentally flawed because of this average cost marginal cost problem. At a whole of system level, it's probably safe to say that benefits outweigh costs, but you really need to be thinking about the individual program level. You can see that I'm getting towards that end there, and it's kind of a little bit unresolved around how I should be presenting this, because I'm a bit stuck with those things. And just in case you were wondering, there really wasn't a quiz. I just thought, I was hoping that you might pay more attention if I told you there was a quiz. And I am struggling a little bit with this cost representation side of things. So particularly happy to hear questions, comments, suggestions in that space. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, James. So just raise your questions if you have now, or comments for James.
James.
Hi, Ken.
Hello. I can see that there's a lot going on here. It's very interesting material. Can you go back to that slide of yours where you show the difference between the marginal cost in the treated group, untreated group, and then how that changes over time? Yeah, way back.
One?
Yeah, this one here, right? These are interesting curves. Now, if I look at the curve on the far right-hand side, these differences are very, very small. Do I read that correctly? Less than 1%, less than 1% in all cases.
That's correct. That is the difference in your probability of return to prison in that month.
I understand. Now, this is a very complicated quantity that you've got here, because we've got over on the left-hand side, we've got the marginal cost through time, and then we have how that marginal cost through time varies across the treatment group. And then on the middle picture, you take the difference in those things. So that involves something like a third or fourth derivative of total cost with all those changes. So this strikes me as being a reasonably fragile sort of calculation because of the nature of things. See, it could be small because the curvature on those two marginal cost curves, I mean, they look like they're sort of proportionally different from the start. Now, I'm wondering, I think it might be worthwhile looking into this a little bit more because of the sort of the higher order nature of the calculation. Do you understand my point?
I do. Yeah, I get your point. In these figures, not the direct cost curves. So the figure on the far left traces the evolution of the recidivism rate through time. So you asymptote to that probability difference in that we've got in here, and that I've got some. I just did some calibrations on these things. So I'm trying. I would agree actually that there's some fragility in these costs, but what I was trying to do here is say, well, these benefits and costs are triggered through time. It matters it matters when you go back to prison, and I want to discount those future things. And at some point, we asymptote to the steady state, the steady recidivism rate, right? And I've said that the literature suggests that's around 5 years. So what I was trying to say, in trying to make the counterfactual, that I'm only looking at that benefit against what would otherwise happen, I'm trying. So that's right. In any given in 1 month out of prison, the difference in the probability of the return to prison for the two groups is 0.6%. And I'm just going to use that difference to trigger my representative costs. The costs, again, there's multiple worksheets that run through the costs. and then whenever you hit that difference, I then discount from that point forward. I've skipped over quite a bit to get the central thrust here. I mean, I think the core thing is this average cost, marginal cost thing. That's just wrong.
Okay, thanks.
Dev.
So I was also going to ask about marginal cost from a different perspective. I just felt I wanted to, you had some examples of average cost and marginal cost for a few particular cases. And it struck me, I just wondered, how much confidence do you have in those marginal costs? I think they're probably harder to measure than the average cost. So do you think that they're real, just in the way that they've been captured?
Yes. So there is a literature that there's basically, these are cost benefit studies that go through, and some of these that are handbook derived, and there are people with real skin in the game on all of that. So on the prison costs, yes, and these guys, these are all peer-reviewed, published literature. There is a big industry in crime statistics and stuff. So these ones, I've actually got I've got standard errors on all of these as well. I just picked a few that and the standard error on the 0 is 0. But I've got measures of uncertainty around all of these things as well, and there's like published cost benefit, peer reviewed. So I think that these are pretty rock solid.
They're okay. Okay. Thanks.
As long as you also buy that labour is you buy that story that labour is an appropriate proxy of marginal cost.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Dave. Michael also has the question. Michael?
He's left the building.
We can't hear you.
Michael, I'm the only one who can hear you, and James also, but maybe.
We can't hear you, Michael.
That's not necessarily a bad thing. I can't hear anything, Michael. Yeah, Ben?
I just wonder where do you draw the line on cost benefit analysis for this? Because presumably if they're spending more time out of prison, they're also in the labour force contributing in some way. Whereas if they're in prison, well, they might be making mail bags, but probably not contributing optimally to the labour force. So do you account for the fact that there's that contribution?
Yeah, I mean, there's these things. There's a yes. There's this is the same as with this cost of illness kind of studies and things about what's in and what's out. I'm not so in some sense it's really only you're saying the lost tax revenue, and I guess my response is something along the lines of to the extent that a country can control its migration borders, it can determine the labour supply in the country, and hence that the fact that these people are out of the labour force is not necessarily relevant. Now that might not be a response that everyone feels comfortable with, but I generally, it's like in some, it's not exactly the same, but say you choose a more leisurely life and to hang out and goof off at work, and then you don't, you choose not to be as productive as you could be for your employer. Is that a cost I need to consider? Because it's a choice to goof off, and you prefer that life. So I get your point, and certainly people do talk about the opportunity cost of lost labour. I personally am less sympathetic to that argument. I am sympathetic to, you know, the real human cost of on families of people that are in prison.
Yeah, so I suppose that's a more. So where do you draw the line? You know, even measuring the benefits of delaying people returning to prison. Well, for some people, prison might be the best place for them, but.
Well, it's clear there are people that do. I mean, that's an unfortunate circumstance that there are people that's a relatively safe environment for them where they can be fed and be safe, because they have a whole range of other issues. But you're right. Look, there is no answer. We can do what's reasonable, and it's possible to disagree. I mean, you know, is 8 million really the intangible cost of the loss of life? You know, this whole analysis hangs on the intangibles, and the intangibles in turn all hang on the proportion of murders in the group. That's the bit that I think is really fragile.
Okay, Michael?
So I did an analog mute there, which caused.
Now we can hear.
Yeah.
Yep.
So I want to, setting myself up, I want to go back to the issue of marginal cost. For South Carolina, that looked like, the $10 looked like the cost of food, close to. And that may be an appropriate one if you're doing a marginal program. But if I run a program out over the whole of South Carolina, presumably I might get my prison population down by 10%. That may mean I'm closing 10% of my prisons. So what's the appropriate cost structure to look at that program level, statewide, when I'm moving beyond just moving a few extra people in and out of cells?
I think that I mean, that's just a proposition that it sits in all of this analysis, and that's what's clearly stated in how you do this. We are not determining the change in the long run structure of things. The way that you do program analysis is to look at marginal costs, and yeah, like they're frighteningly low. But if you watch any of these things, you can see that the extent to which prisons are stacked up. You may or may not be aware of that food runs out, and that the families of prisoners put money into an account so that they can buy food. So these places are run in a pretty horrible way, right? So the average person in prison is having money transferred into their account from family members to pay for things.
But if I'm the governor of South Carolina, aren't I looking at this as a way of changing the entire system?
You're looking at understanding your program evaluation, and you're evaluating a program, and you look at what it changes in the marginal cost. That's what you do. You look at marginal cost and marginal benefit.
Thank you. One quick question from Said.
You mentioned that you contacted the original authors, James. So what was the response in terms of average cost and marginal cost issue?
They didn't they didn't really address that. They sort of stated that it wasn't the main. It was sort of an informal. So they give these qualifying comments all at the start of when they do this, and they say to do all of these things, you would need to look at marginal cost and all of these things. Yet we can illustrate how strong the case is, and so we don't even have to do any of that by that presenting that example that I gave, right? So they say, look, you have to get all, we acknowledge you have to get all marginal costs, and you have to do, this is what you would really do. But if you just look at the difference between these numbers, they're so great that you don't have to worry about that, because you can be confident even if you did, it'd still it would still pay for itself, and plus there's all these other benefits that we're not including.
Okay, so the difference is so great, then it does not matter how you calculate your cost. That's what basically
that was their line, and they were saying like this is not. They say that this is not cost benefit analysis in their in the preamble, but then of course the bit that's cited all the time is that cost of treatment versus this, right? All of the preceding qualifications in the paragraph before that don't ever feature in anyone's, if you look in the policy space, what they've grabbed.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, let me thank James for very comprehensive presentation. So time is over. Next week, we are going to have another interesting presentation on conservation actions from Professor Stephen Silusi. So see you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.